So I'm inside the lesson folder for the desk scene project, and I'm looking at the project rubric. And there's a checklist here of all the things that you should keep in mind. And I just want to remind you to review this document. And I'm also looking at the project requirements. And we've already dealt with the desk and the pen and the paper and all of these objects with the exception of the can. And this will be the last required item. Now you'll notice that inside my scene, I have other elements that are inside my scene that kind of help to finish off this assignment. So, make sure that you consider, including other assets, but these are the things that are absolutely required for the project. And the one thing that we have not yet dealt with is the can. And I want to take the opportunity to use the can as a very specific modeling strategy. And just as a reminder, I'm going to go into my desk scene, and when you downloaded and unzipped your desk scene assets, there's a reference folder. It's the same place that we referenced the pen and the lamp, and there's also a can folder. Inside the can folder, there's a couple of different can references with some, a few other graphics. I rendered out a completed can scene that I designed with a, with a simple glass of its contents next to it, just as a reference. And what we'll do is we'll reference a can from a direct reference graphic. So in other words, we'll actually place one of these graphics, it doesn't matter which one. I'm probably going to use the Dr. Pepper or the new Coke can. When I look at this new Coke can, there's a really nice flat profile on the side here that will really help to describe the contour of the shape of the can. It'll also help us establish the proportion. By placing this graphic actually inside the scene, we'll have a visual reference. Now there's a couple of different ways that we can do this. I'll jump back into Cinema 4D, and what I'll do is I'm going to create a cylinder. And just like we did with the coffee mug, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this to a new layer. I'll quickly open up the layer manager, and I'll call this can, and I'll just immediately solo that content. I'll make it a little bit shorter. I'll take a deeper dive into exactly how I'm going to reference this object in just a moment. But I'm going to split the viewport. And I'm going to focus on the front view for just a moment. And I'm going to go to the Options pull-down menu, and I'm going to choose the Configure drop-down. The Configure option from the drop-down menu. So I'm going to Options, Configure. With the Configure, I'm configuring the viewport. So I can turn on lots of different options. I can go through the display, filter, view, and so on. What I'm interested in is the back tab. And in the back tab, we can load an image for reference. And so I'll just click on the ellipse. I'll navigate to my project folder, into my desk scene, into reference, into my can folder. And from here, I'll either grab the Dr. Pepper or the new Coke or maybe this Pepsi can, whatever it is. It's just a visual reference. I'll grab the Dr. Pepper. And so now I have this graphic in the background. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to model this. I'll scale this object up, or I'll build it so that it's more or less in proportion with the can, and that as I extrude this and start to model it, I'm really paying attention to the reference. So I want to run through the modeling portion of this as quickly as possible. My strategy here is I'm going to select this cylinder, and I'm just going to try to rough out a few things. I'm setting the height, and I'm paying attention to where the curve starts to happen, or the taper at the top of the can. The radius I'll set, and I'll push that out roughly to the width of the can. And I'm not going to be perfect with this, but this will kind of really help with the proportion of the can relative to the rest of the object. I'll change my display to some kind of shading with lines, and I'll bump up my height segmentation. Now I'm not actually seeing the segmentation in this view, and that probably has to do with I'm looking at isoparms from the display pull down menu. I want to change this to wireframe, and now I actually see the wireframe of the object. So I added just a little bit of segmentation in here so that I have some options when it comes to sculpting the edge of the can. I'll jump back to my perspective view just for a moment, and I'll make this object editable. and I'll run into the mesh menu commands and optimize just like we've done for previous cylinders. And so the next thing I'll do is I'll grab my live select tool, and I will make a quick note that I've turned only select visible elements back on so that I don't select through the object, and I'll just select the top. Now I'm going to do a little bit of modeling here, and so if I'm going to be spending some time focused on modeling, I always want to change the layout over to modeling mode, and that allows me to get in really quickly here and grab the extrusion tool and make some other modifications. So what I'm going to do is I'll grab extrude, and I'll extrude in the perspective view port just like I've been doing, but I'll really pay close attention to what's happening in the front viewport here. So I'm just going to extrude this up a little bit. I'm going to go to scale, and I could do this in the front viewport as well. In fact, I'll just maximize this really quickly. But just notice that I still have the top of my can selected. So I'll jump back to the extrusion tool, and I'll give this a real quick extrude, and I'll go back to scale, and I'll scale that in. And now I'm starting to make some assumptions about what's happening in the can. And I'm going to continue to extrude this, but I'll make some really small extrusions. And the reason I'm making such small extrusions as I start to scale this is I know the way that the hypernurbs works is that when I throw this into a hypernurbs object, if I have edges that are very close together, there's going to be a tighter transition or a tighter curve with some of this information towards the top of the can. So the smaller I make these extrusions, the tighter any kind of curve is going to be once it's inside a hypernurbs object. So I'm really just kind of thinking about the top edge. So I'm continuing just to extrude little by little and try to, really kind of follow the contour of what I think is happening on the edge of the can. So that looks pretty good. I got the basic edge described here. And you'll see that once I throw this into the hypernurbs object, there's going to be some strangeness that happens. Now, particularly down here, I think there's probably just not enough geometry to maintain a really sharp edge the way that's happening with this can. But I want to focus on the top of the can just for a moment. And I'm going to use this extrude inner tool to do the same thing that we did when we were extruding the coffee mug. So I'll just kind of do a quick extrude inner. I'll tap the S key so I can see this a little bit more clearly. I'll do a standard extrusion, but this time I'll extrude inwards. Okay, so I'll extrude that down just a little bit. And, if I extrude down and I have the geometry to do so, I can also move this in case I didn't get the geometry quite where I wanted it. So I'll just push that down a little bit further. I'll go back to extrude inner, so I extrude to the parallel to the surface of the can, and I'll just kind of pick that up. So I'm actually moving it this time around. So I can start to see the top of that can kind of buckle towards the top. I'll do another extrude inner, and I'll do the same thing. I'll just kind of lift that up. So I'm kind of now getting this bow in the top of the can. Okay, so it's just a real roughing out that can. I neglected the bottom, so I'll split the viewport out again. And really, as far as the bottom goes, I just want to be mindful of this because I want to get the proportions right. I do want to kind of, try to achieve that same nuance towards the bottom of the can as well. So I'll select the bottom surfaces just like I did for the top, and I'll go to extrusion, and I'll do this in the front viewport here. So I'll extrude down. I'll do another extrusion and a quick scale inwards, and I'll just continue that same technique I used at the top, just scaling and extruding as I go. And again, I'm making some quick decisions about how much I should extrude and how much I should scale. And it's based a lot on what the actual shape is and then what I expect to happen once I actually throw this object into hypernurbs. And so for the bottom, I'll just maximize the perspective view, and I'll do that same technique I did for the top, which is I'll do a little extrude inner, okay, just to give myself a little bit of geometry on the edge. And I'll do a standard extrusion, and I'll push that back up into the can. So that's going to give me really the bottom of the can effect. That looks pretty good. I'll do another extrude inner, and I'll just take that extrude inner and move it down just a little bit, just to really kind of cause the rounding of the bottom of the can. And I'm pretty satisfied with that as the rough can. Now you'll see that I'm not going to worry about the tab of the can at this point. A little outside the scope of this project. Certainly tackle it if you feel like you want to, but I think the details of this scene are going to allow for the can just to sit on screen, particularly when we wrap a texture around this object. So I'll go back to the model mode of the tool, and I'm going to create a hypernurbs, and I'm in that same boat. Remember, the hypernurbs object was created inside my scene, but I've soloed the can layer. So what I'll do is I'll just unsolo. I'll throw my cylinder or my can back into the object, or into the hypernurbs. And of course I could rename that hypernurbs. Now my can is huge relative to the rest of the desk because I modeled according to you know, the proportion of the reference image, so I could always scale this down. Okay, but I'm going to solo that again just for a moment, and I'll take a closer look at this. And you can see that I've really lost a lot of the detail. In fact, if I look at my perspective viewport here, I'll select my hypernurbs. I moved it. Okay, but if I just kind of move that down a little bit and I'll focus on the front viewport, you can see that I really lost a lot of the detail here when it comes to those really tight transitions, and that has everything to do with the amount of geometry that I have inside my can. Okay, there's not a whole lot of information here on the edge of the can, and the minute that I throw that hypernurbs on, you can see there's a really lazy curve here around the corner, and that has a lot to do with the way that this geometry is smoothed out. And the way that I can start to control that is I can just start to cut some more lines in using the knife tool. So I'll just turn off the hypernurbs for a moment. And remember, in earlier presentations, I've mentioned that if to get a tighter corner or a more articulated angle when it comes to hypernurbs, you got to have 2 points or 2 edges very close together, or really you need 3 to kind of control that transition. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into, let's see, I'll select the can itself. Got to make sure that the actual model is selected. I'm going to go to Mesh and Create, and I'm looking for the knife tool. It's not letting me choose the knife tool. That's because I'm not in the component mode. I need to either be in edge, line, or polygon mode. Once I have point, edge, or polygon mode selected, I can go under Mesh, Create, and I can choose the knife tool. Or I can just tap the K key on the keyboard. I'm going to go into attributes, and with the knife tool selected, I'm going to change the mode from line to loop. This is something we've looked at before. And what I'll do is I'll roll over one of these edges here, and my goal is I'm going to try to cut an edge right into my doodle tool here. Tools, doodle. There we go. I'm going to try to cut an edge really close. And of course, I'm painting on a doodle that's been soloed, so let me just turn that. I'm going to cut an edge in right here. And I'm going to cut an edge in right here. And what that's going to do is that's going to help describe a really kind of tight transition of that angle there. So I'll get rid of my doodle and I'll go back to my can layer. So I'll tap the K key, which will bring up the knife tool again. Once I select my geometry, I'll start seeing that loop. It's still in loop mode, so I'm just going to click. And I didn't quite get that exactly where I want it, so I'll undo. I'll zoom in so I get a little bit more control over this. So I'm getting really close to that edge, really close to that edge there. And now when I turn on this hypernurbs, you can see that there's a really tight transition now. So when I zoom out, I can see that I've kind of maintained that shape or that tight transition up here towards the top of the can. I'll do the same thing in here. I'll just cut in 2 really tight loops right about there, and that'll help to really maintain this really nice flat line here, and then a really nice tight transition around the corner. So now when I back off, you can see that I've helped to articulate the top of that can shape, and I think that pretty much does it for the can. I do want to talk a little bit about applying textures, and I want to talk about restricting certain textures to certain parts of the can. So we'll do that very quickly. I'm going to unsolo the can layer, and I'll make sure that my entire can hypernurbs is selected, and then I'll go back into the model mode of the tool, and I'll just lift this up, and I could scale this down now, or I could apply the material now. I think I'll scale it a little bit just to get a little bit closer to the size of a can. And I'll worry about the exact size of it here in just a minute. But that looks pretty good. And I'll zoom in. I'm not going to worry about the fact that it's laying right on top of my mug at this point. I want to get to the task of throwing a material on this. Now, inside your text folder, I'll just go back to my standard layout. I want to point out that inside your text folder, if I can minimize some of this stuff here, desk scene text, I've included a can.pst. Now there's a couple of other things you can use. Coke can if you want to. There's a Photoshop document that I just mocked up a quick label inside Photoshop. It's in layers, and you can modify those as needed to design your own can, or you can use an existing can label. What I'll do is I'll just create a real quick can label. Call that can label. And on the color channel, with the color channel selected, I'll load that label in. So let's load this can high-res label. And I do want to make this reflective because it will be, it is aluminum and it is going to pick up some of the reflective information in the environment. Now, I could just take this can label and throw it on the can object, but you're going to see some strange stuff happening. There's going to be some really strange stretching going on, and things aren't going to look great. And also, I don't want that can texture to be stretched over the top of the can. The way that this can is going to be put together is that along the top of the can, it's going to be the aluminum material of the can. Along the bottom of the can, it'll be the same thing, and in the center, it will be the label. And so what I need to do is I need to start to reserve different materials for different parts of the can. And so the first thing I'll do is I'll select the material that I just applied and I'll delete it. The next thing that I'll do is I'll make the base material, or the material that I want underneath the label. So I'll call this can metal. So it's the kind of the metal material of the can itself. And this will be kind of like an aluminum color. So I'll make it just a little gray. Maybe I'll add a little blue to it. And I'll definitely make it somewhat reflective. Not too much, but just enough reflectivity so it kind of looks like just a real simple metal. It's kind of gray, it's reflective. I'll throw that on, and I could render it really quickly to give it a test, but I'm pretty satisfied with that. The next thing I'm going to do, and I'll turn off the hypernurbs so I can see this a little bit more clearly. I want to select the area that I want to restrict the material to. Now I'll show you two different ways to do this. I'll show you the really easy way, and then I'll show you the real way to do it that gives you a lot of control over this. So the easy method goes like this. I've applied the first texture already. Okay, that's the metal texture. That's the first layer of the texture. The next thing that I want to do is I want to go into the geometry of the model, and I'll go into Polygon. And I want to select the areas that I want to apply this next material to. So I'll do a quick UL. So I'm making a loop selection. I'm going to stay in loop mode, and I'm going to shift click. Alternatively, what I could do is I could select the center loop in this case, and I could go to the select material, and somewhere in here is grow selection. And the grow selection is kind of cool because if I choose grow, you'll see what happens is that it searches the selection that you have and selects everything that's the next set of polygons out. And I can do that one more time. I'll say select grow selection, and you can obviously do the opposite too. You can do a shrink selection. Now I'll do a quick loop selection because I do want to add one more loop, and so I have the entire selection that's been made. And now what I could do is I could just take the can material that I want and drag and drop it on there. Now I'm going to get a little bit of artifacting here, and I can actually see it in the preview. And as I look at this, I actually might have wanted to apply the material up here as well. But once I applied and just dragged and dropped that material, it's now preserved to the actual selection that I've had. There's another way to manage it. We'll actually do the same thing, but we can take a little bit better control over it. But while I'm here, I have the material selected. I'm going to go to the projection type, just like we did for the coffee mug, and I'll change it from UVW mapping to cylindrical mapping. And now I have a lot of control over it. I can play with the UV offset, so I can rotate that material. I can do the same thing with the V offset and kind of move that around and make sure that some of the information that I've designed here at the top of the label kind of fits in here. And I could do the same thing with the scale to make sure that I'm getting the top and the bottom to map up properly. And so just with a real quick, with a real quick kind of adjustment here, I'll kind of slide this material around, and I could rough that in really quickly. I'll take this whole object, make sure I'm in model mode, and I'll just kind of move this over, and I'll set it down on top of the table. Make sure I don't push it through the table, and I'll give that a quick render. Okay, so there's my render. I have my material applied. I definitely want to tweak this, and I probably want to change the selection a bit, and then I can see now that I've fully rendered the top. I still have a little bit of work to do on the top of my can, but that's the basic idea of preserving selections to different parts of the material. In a later presentation, I'll share with you a more sophisticated way, a couple different ways to really make complex selections, preserve those selections, and restrict material to the different areas of a model. So. But I'll do that in a later presentation. For now, I think we have enough information to model our can. I don't like the reflectivity of the texture. It's not even so much the reflectivity. The base material of the can, I feel like it needs to be a little bit darker. So I'll make that darker. I'll probably make it, I don't want to make the reflection darker. That's an easy mistake to make. I actually want to make the can color darker. There we go. That's the material that I'm looking for. A much darker material, and I'll go back into the reflection and make sure that the reflection's a little bit more reflective. That looks pretty good. I also want to make sure that my material color here, the actual color map of the can, is reflective, and I did turn on the reflectivity there. That looks pretty good. So I'll continue to push forward. I'll continue to experiment with different modeling of different objects inside my scene to help populate the desk. And as I mentioned before, we can also go into the content browser and continue to add some stuff. In the next presentation, I'll make one final pass to make some considerations about my environment and my lighting. And at that point, I think you have everything you need to know to successfully complete the desk project. But we'll have one more presentation to button this thing up. Make sure that you post your works in progress and any questions that you have in the discussion board. And we'll catch up in the next presentation.